Once upon a time, there was a famous leader named Moses. He led the Israelites out of Egypt and performed many miracles. But what about his sons, Gershom and Eliezer? We don't hear much about them in the Bible. In this story, we'll try to find out what happened to them. This story is about how everyone has an important job in God's plan, even if they are not famous. Sometimes the most important work is done behind the scenes. This story is for people who feel like they are not important or that their work is not noticed. It shows that everyone's work is important and that God has a plan for everyone. Have you ever wondered about the sons of Moses, Gershom and Eliezer? They were the brothers of Aaron, the famous high priest. But why don't we hear much about them? In this video, we'll explore their lives and find out what happened to them after leading the Israelites out of Egypt. When Moses was living in exile in Midian, he met a beautiful woman named Zipporah. They fell in love and had their first son. Moses named him Gershom, which means, "I have become a foreigner." This name reflected Moses' feelings of being an outsider in a strange land. He had once been a prince in Egypt, but now he was a shepherd in a foreign country. Years later, Moses had another son named Eleazar, which means God is my help. This name showed how grateful Moses was to God for guiding him through difficult times. When Moses was running away from Pharaoh, he remembered how God had helped him. He was grateful for God's protection and said, "My father's God was my helper." Moses had two sons, Gershom and Eliezer. Eleazar's name meant, "God is my help." This name reminded Moses of how God had always been there for him. Unlike Aaron's descendants, Gershom and Eliezer didn't become leaders or play important roles in the Exodus story. When God chose Moses for a big job, Gershom and Eliezer were still young. Moses felt like he wasn't good enough for this important task. When Moses was going back to Egypt, he took his family with him. This showed that even though he had a big job to do, he still cared about his wife and children. The Bible doesn't talk much about what Gershom and Eliezer did during this time, but their presence reminds us that Moses had to balance his important work with his responsibilities as a father and husband. There was one important thing that happened to Gershom. Once, when Moses was on a journey, God was very angry with him. This was because Moses had forgotten to do something important. Moses' wife, Zipporah, saw what was happening. She quickly did something to help Moses. She circumcised their son, and then she touched Moses' feet with a special tool. This action saved Moses' life. This story shows how important it was to follow God's rules. Zipporah's quick thinking saved her family from danger. This story shows that even important people like Moses have to follow God's rules. Zipporah's actions helped her family and reminded everyone of the importance of obeying God. Even though Gershom and Eliezer were part of Moses' journey, we don't hear much about them later. There might be a few reasons for this. One reason is that God chose Aaron and his family to be priests. This meant that Aaron's sons were very important. They were responsible for doing special things in the temple. Another reason is that Moses was a very special person. He was a prophet, which means he could talk to God. He was also a leader and a mediator, which means he helped people understand God's message. But being a prophet didn't mean his sons would also be prophets. Another reason why we don't hear much about Gershom and Eliezer is that they might have gone back to live with their mother in Midian. This means they might not have been around for many of the important things that happened to Moses. Even though we don't hear much about Gershom and Eliezer in the Exodus story, their family continued to be important. Their descendants were part of the Levites, a group of people who helped take care of the temple. Although they weren't priests like Aaron's descendants, they still played an important role in serving God. Gershom and Eleazar's descendants helped take care of the temple. They did things like guarding the temple and helping the priests. Even though they were important, their work wasn't as famous as the work of the priests. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what Gershom's descendants did, but we do know that one of them was named Shubael. Shubael was a leader among the Levites. This means he was important, but not as important as the priests. Eliezer's family grew very large. This shows that even though they weren't priests, they were still a big and important part of the Levites. Eleazar's family grew very large. This was different from many other families, which became smaller over time. This shows that God blessed Eleazar's family. Even though they weren't priests, Eleazar's descendants were still important. They helped keep the temple running smoothly. The difference between the descendants of Moses and Aaron shows that God chose different people for different jobs. Aaron's descendants were chosen to be priests, while Moses' descendants were chosen to help the priests. Gershom and Eliezer were important, but they weren't as famous as their father Moses. This shows that even though you're related to someone important, that doesn't mean you'll be important too. The story of Gershom and Eliezer teaches us that everyone has a special job to do. Even if you're not famous, your life is still important to God. The Bible tells us that God has a plan for everyone. Sometimes things happen in a way that we don't expect, but we can trust that God's timing is always perfect. Gershom and Eliezer were important parts of Israel's history. Even though they weren't famous, they were still part of God's plan. This story teaches us that even if we don't see the results right away, our good deeds can help future generations. The Bible tells us that people who love and obey God will be blessed. If you have enjoyed the video so far, please support me by liking and sharing it with others. Gershom and Eliezer's descendants continued to serve God. This shows that even if we don't get recognized for what we do, it's still important to be faithful. The Bible tells us that God sees everything we do, even if no one else does. Moses was a great leader, but he also had challenges and doubts. This shows that even important people can have tough times. The story of Gershom and Eliezer reminds us that what's really important is to obey God, not to be famous. The story of Gershom and Eliezer teaches us that it's important to be humble and to put others before yourself. Even though they weren't famous, they were still important to God. The Bible tells us that God looks at our hearts, not just our appearance. This means that it's more important to be good on the inside than to be famous. Even though Gershom and Eliezer weren't widely celebrated, they were still part of God's chosen people. This shows that everyone has a special job to do, and that every job is important. Many people today feel like they're not important, but the story of Gershom and Eliezer shows us that we can find purpose in the things that God has given us to do. Even if our work is small, it's still important to God. Like Moses' sons, we may be called to serve in a quiet way, but that doesn't mean our work is any less important. Gershom and Eliezer's story shows us that God's plan is bigger than we can imagine. Even when we don't understand why things happen the way they do, we can trust that God has a good reason. Their story also teaches us that every act of service is important, no matter how small. Even if no one else sees what we're doing, God sees it. So, the next time you feel like you're not important, remember the story of Gershom and Eliezer. They were part of God's plan, even though they weren't famous. And so are you.